Welcome to our United Methodist Alumni and Friends virtual gathering, a free and continuing education event for United Methodists, sponsored by Union Presbyterian Seminary. President Brian Blount will offer a seminary update. Assistant Professor of Theology and Ethics, Dr. Rachel Baard, will present In Search of Truth and Reconciliation, Ministry in a Purple World. Q&A will immediately follow. Our host is Reverend Dr. Clay Macaulay, Director for Alumni Development at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Clay, the floor is yours.
Mike, I thank you. Grace and peace to you, and welcome to our annual alumni gathering, usually held during the Virginia Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. My name is Clay Macaulay, and I am now in my 6th year as Director of Alumni Development for Union Presbyterian Seminary. And it is a delight for me to see many of our alumni and friends gathered here virtually. Of course, we wish we could be together in person, as some of us did for a luncheon in Roanoke almost 21 months ago in June 2019. Yet I believe the days are drawing near when we can come together as colleagues and alumni once again, whether at a future annual conference meeting or on our campuses in Richmond and in Charlotte. Let's begin our time together with a word of prayer. Would you pray with me? God, our refuge and strength, shelter us under your wings as we come before you in grief and pain. In the midst of this global pandemic, we pray for all those who have lost a beloved child, parent, sibling, lover, or friend, those who have and continue to suffer from COVID-19, and for those who care for them, those who are wounded in body or spirit. For each of them is a child made in your image. We pray for ourselves, O Lord. Restore our hope and mend our hearts, even as we weep with grief and tremble with anger. Give us strength to support the brokenhearted, your grace to be confident in your presence here, and your light to find our way in the darkness, that we may be bearers of your light to all we encounter. And in the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. I now call on Dr. Brian Blount, President and Professor of New Testament, to offer his greetings and to provide us with an update on Union Presbyterian Seminary. Dr. Blount?
Thank you very much, Clay. And it is a delight to see faces here on the screen and to see some names as well where I don't see the faces. It's very good to be in your company always. Like Clay, I'm sorry we're not able to be together in person, but I'm looking forward to that day when that will happen soon. Let me share just a few brief things about what's going on at the seminary. I'm excited about where we are these days. We continue, as you probably know or would want to know, we continue our partnerships with Wesley Theological Seminary and with Pfeiffer University so that we can have connections for United Methodist faculty for our students to do theology and history and worship. So those partnerships continue, and it helps us develop this ecumenical setting and flavor in the classroom to be able to resource our United Methodist students in a way that strengthens them in their work for their future ministry. I'm also excited when I talk about ecumenical partnerships that we have. We are on the cusp now beginning a Baptist House of Studies here on the Richmond campus at the seminary. So we'll have a retinue of Baptist students as well as United Methodist students, and we'll have a similar kind of connection where we'll have Baptist faculty who will do polity and theology and Baptist history. So we're following the United Methodist model as we move into other denominational connections. So you've helped us chart a path in a really good way, and I'm deeply appreciative of that. I also want to mention our 3 centers, which I'm really excited about. You know, the heart and soul of a seminary is its faculty and its library. We have just a tremendous faculty, as you all know. I don't have to tell you, you've studied under many of them. This faculty has also helped us dream about new ways of engaging our ministry, not only in the classroom, but how we connect the classroom to broader sweeps of theological education and understanding. And not just on the campuses, Richmond and Charlotte, but also as we extend the boundaries of our campus into the church and the world. So we have the Sigmund Rhee Global Mission Center for Christian Education, which has been building relationships with churches and with schools across our world, particularly in Asia and Africa and India, which I'm very excited about. We're drawing students to the campus. We are drawing faculty to the campus, and we're planning travel seminars and short courses. I was really excited about one that was going to happen in Ethiopia just this year until the pandemic derailed all of that. We also had 12 international students who were coming to be a part of the Global Mission Center's work in the initial work that James Tinetti was developing for us, and the pandemic disrupted that. But we're not losing heart. We're going to continue building those relationships, and we're going to continue to have our faculty and students travel, and faculty and students from other places in the world travel here as soon as the travel opportunities open up again. We also have the center, the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership, which is just moving along at a significant clip, even as we remember Katie's memory, as we think about how we can build a legacy for her vision of womanist studies. So here, Dr. Melanie Jones has taken a position as an assistant professor in ethics, and she is now the director of the Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership, and is preparing, even as we speak, for her first time directing the center's annual gathering, which will be virtual. And I've been seeing the way they've been preparing. It's going to be a phenomenal event. So I've registered for it. I'd encourage you to go on our website and register for that. It's in early April. I can't remember the dates exactly right now, but matter of fact, I'll look after I finish and I'll put it in the chat just so you'll be able to know the dates for that. But it should be a significant, wonderful event in the way those preparations are going. And then, of course, we have the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation that Rodney Sadler leads out of our Charlotte campus. And those centers, the Womanist Leadership and the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation, have been putting on virtual conversations about issues related to theology and social justice all through this academic year. And those have been exciting. They've been gathering faculty members and experts from across the country and the world to have conversations. You know, I've just been delighted on Tuesday and Thursday evenings when they have those. So again, I would encourage you to look at our website, to look at if you look at the seminary's website, up at the top bar, there's a thing that says centers. Click on it, and then you can go to the website for each of those centers and find out more information about what they're doing and the virtual programs that we'll be having. Also excited about degree programs. You know, we have our retinue, the main ones, the MDiv, the MACE, the THM. We have added a Doctor of Ministry program that's going very well on both the Charlotte and the Richmond campus. So if you're thinking about a doctorate in ministry, please think about applying to Union. We also have a wonderful student body, and the faculty is engaged with them. Matter of fact, I was this morning in an email conversation with a rabbi here in Richmond who's interested in the D-Min on the Richmond campus. So again, a diverse student body that we're building. It'd be wonderful to have a rabbi in conversation with the persons of other denominational representations in a D-Min course. So I'm hopeful that he will remain as excited as he seemed to be about it in the email. We also have the Master of Arts in Public Theology. You'll be hearing from Dr. Rachel Baard. She is directing that master's program. Again, I'm excited about the possibilities there for how we can help students expand their conversation theologically, not just about what's going on in the theological and spiritual and sacred arena, but also how we connect that to the sacred, the spiritual and the sacred, how we blend those two together. And I'm sorry, the sacred and the secular, how we blend those two together, how we think about theology in a public arena. So we're really very much trying to live into our understanding as being a seminary for the church in the world. You might also tell people who are interested about our Pathways program. Again, you can find out about that online. Using virtual technology, Zoom technology, we are having a curriculum of courses where you are able to do a certificate if you would like, or you can just come on to do. I taught the Gospel of Mark that way. It's taught in the evenings, and it's directed for people in the church. So I hope you might find yourself interested in that as a possibility. In fact, when I thought about certificates, I should have said that the Master of Arts in Public Theology, we're doing that as a 2-year degree program, but it's also being done as a certificate, I think, that will be available, and it's done in a hybrid format. So you don't have to necessarily relocate to Richmond to be a participant in that program. And then just a couple of other things, because I want to see if I want to make sure I'm in the appropriate time frame. We are right now, as we think about Charlotte and Richmond, and we think about our strategic visioning process, we have focused on a couple of areas in our strategic plan, the 5-year plan. We're in the first year of it. And the 2 areas we focused on immediately are the ones that are about building a more diverse student body and faculty, so that our faculty and student body are representative of the world in which our students go out to lead in whatever form of ministry they're doing. And also to be able to equip the seminary with the kind of technological support so that we can meet the needs of more online and hybrid teaching, and of course cross-campus teaching, where faculty are teaching students who are in cross campuses between Richmond and Charlotte. So we have developed a technology task force that's given us recommendations about how we can strengthen our online technological capabilities, and we developed a diversity task force that has helped us think about how we can do better in recruiting a more diverse faculty and a more diverse student body. So these are also things that excite me as we try to help the seminary move into its next 100 years of which will be the 200 to 300 years of its existence of theological education. Now, I've said a good little bit there. I could say more. Usually, I spend about 20 minutes to 30 minutes telling groups about the seminary. I don't want to spend that much time today because I want you to hear Dr. Baard. But I do think I've saved just about 2 or 3 minutes, haven't I? Yeah, I've saved a few minutes for some questions if you have any, which is unusual for me. So please take advantage of this opportunity. I usually ramble on and on right up to the end time. That's a Book of Revelation joke, but you're not laughing. You get that? Ramble up to the end time? Yeah. See what I did? Okay. All right, Crystal, I'll stop. All right. Are there any questions? Do you have any questions? If you don't, let me put in a shameless plug for the Sprunt Lectures. We're going to have a wonderful Sprunt lecture series, and Clay can tell you a little bit more about that. But Ted Lewis is going to be with us from Emory University. Is going to be talking about the future of theological education. Is a pretty provocative title about are we coming to the end of theological education? Something like that. I don't think that his answer is going to be yes, but I'm going to be very interested to see how he gets to whatever answer he gets to with that lecture title. But I hope you'll join us for that. And again, you can find that information on the website. So if there aren't any questions, I'm going to turn it over to Crystal. Good to see you all.
Right. Hello, everybody. I'm Reverend Crystal Siegel. I'm the Director of Hospitality Ministries at Union Presbyterian Seminary, appointed by Bishop Sharma Lewis here. It's my privilege to work here, and I'm an alumna as well, and I'm appointed alongside some wonderful United Methodist colleagues here today with us on the call. Dorothy Tripodi you'll hear from later, and also Tim Moore that you'll hear from later as well. We're going to do this raffle very simply. I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 50, and if you will just put in the chat what number you're thinking of, I'll tell you what you've won. Nope. Aha. Uh-oh. Keep going. There it is. James, you won. And I'm going to show everybody what you won. Yeah, I really hope this is going to work. I spent some time practicing, if you can. Oh, let's see if this works. Yes? Can you see it? Did it go? Can you see it? You can't see it. I'm terrible at this. Well, he won a mug. He won a mug. And he won a mug because you all have received, hopefully, a tea bag from us with a great encouragement, which is a pun on one of our most beloved sayings about doing all that you can, all the good you can, and all the places you can, all the times to all the people. And so we said, brew all the good you can with the tea bag. So today, as a companion to your tea bag, James, thank you so much. Michael, thank you. James, you are awarded this ever so priceless mug. We hope that you will use it in good health as you are brewing and doing all the good you can in your ministry. Thank you so much for being here today. And now I believe I'm kicking it back to Clay. Is that right? No, I'm kicking it to Dorothy. My esteemed Methodist colleague, Reverend Dr. Dorothy Tripodi, will you please take over and get me out of this?
Glad to. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Rachel Baard, Assistant Professor for Theology and Ethics here on the Richmond campus. Dr. Baard joined the UPSM faculty in Richmond the fall 2019 semester. She has earned her PhD from Princeton University after doing a Master's of Theology and undergraduate work at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. Her interests include feminist theology, theology of resistance, and public theology. Her book, Sexism and Sin Talk, Feminist Conversations on the Human Condition, won the Andrew Murray and Desmond Tutu Book Prize in South Africa. I have personally enjoyed getting to know Dr. Baard. And of course, when you're from Germany and when you're from South Africa, you cannot help but talk about the impact that such events like the Holocaust and apartheid have had, not only on your own cultures, but on the church, on Christians, and as the Church Universal is grappling with the impact of such violence and trauma. And so that is one reason why I'm so excited that she's going to talk today to us about truth and about reconciliation. But before she does, I would like also to add that she is a tremendous colleague and has become a friend. And James can attest to the fact that if you have supervised ministry or field education and theology on a Friday morning at 8:30, exciting things happen. Let's just say that between Dr. Baard's class and my class on December 6th, we had the best shining shoes in the world because the students took our joke serious to have shiny shoes for St. Nicholas Day so they could get their South African tea and their German cookies. So there is also hospitality and hope in these ongoing conversations. I give you Dr. Rachel Baard, In Search of Truth and Reconciliation, Ministry in a Purple World.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tripodi. I did not know about the shining shoes part of that deal. That sounds to me like bad theology because it sounds like they had to merit grace. And we should never, ever operate with that. That is heretical. We'll have to have a long chat about this. One side correction, as a proud Presbyterian, I did not graduate from Princeton University. I graduated from that far superior institution, Princeton Seminary. So let me just add that.
I will introduce you to a prevenient grace that restores the ability to shine shoes. Okay, so anyways, it is going to be so good to hear you.
We'll have to have a long chat about the nature of justification and sanctification. I just talked about that last night, so it's fresh in my mind. Thank you so much that
You're
I
welcome.
spent some time with all of you today. I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint because in my experience, my accent is just heavy enough to make it difficult to follow me. Plus, I may have a few odd names that you probably need to see on the screen in order to follow along. So I'm just going to pull up. I think I got the subtitle of our talk wrong today, but close enough. And I'm going to make it a proper slideshow so that you can see. So in search of truth and reconciliation, living in a purple world, or ministry in a purple world. Now, you know that we often speak of purple churches or a purple world to refer to the reality that our congregations and our country and our culture are all deeply divided. We often think about hot button issues such as the wretched gay debate, as it's sometimes called, that I know is an issue right now in the Methodist Church as well as it has been and still is in many other churches. Topics like abortion and gun control, these days even about who won the election, and of course the probably the most significant one, most serious one on race and racism. So we're talking about the culture wars, but we're also talking about something deeper, the things that underlie the culture wars. Deeper divides, a history of racial injustice, which of course shaped much of those culture wars, economic disparities, and so forth. So in a world such as this, how do we find ways to move forward? How do we create more justice, more peace? How do we find truth? How do we find reconciliation? Now, I should start with a disclaimer. I am not a practical theologian. That's why my students did not have shiny shoes. I am a systematic theologian. And so I don't have a skill set in things like conflict management. I have some experience on that, but nothing on a professional level. What I do have to offer you are two intertwined things. The one, lessons from my own historical context. I've now spent about half my life, close to half my life in the United States, but the first half of my life was in South Africa. And I lived during some of the most tumultuous years of South Africa's history. So I'll offer a few ideas from that history, but also, of course, insights from the Christian theological tradition, to which you need no further introduction, except that I would like to just take out a few central thoughts on this theme. But let me start by thinking about the color purple. There's the reason why I chose purple as my background for my PowerPoint here. The color has actually had some theological significance for me, and it's all thanks to Alice Walker, who in her novel, The Color Purple, has this amazingly beautiful rendition of exactly that primacy of grace that we were just kidding around about a little bit. When Celie asks Shug, "You telling me God love you and you ain't never done nothing for him?" And Shug replies, "But if God love me, Celie, I don't have to do all that unless I want to. There's a lot of other things I can do that I expect God likes. I can simply sit back and wonder at things, be happy, be beautiful." Now, I'm mindful that we do need sanctification as well, but Shug is right. Our sanctified lives rest on God's love and are not a prerequisite for God's love. So for me, this has been a beautiful theological element in that novel. Elsewhere, Walker would quip that womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. And I myself have used this color association when I wrote an essay on global women's theologies to think in terms of a quilt with various shades of purple and periwinkle and lavender and violet. There were a few other synonyms, I don't remember them all, but a purplish quilt. Now, this is nothing to do really with our topic, but I want to start with that to suggest that if we think about this other purple reality, this reality of political and cultural divides that we are talking about, that we keep something of Alice Walker's spirit in us, that we first of all leave behind our anxieties and trust in God's grace, who works in and through us, but also that we embrace beauty and that we embrace diversity. And that so we think about these issues from that angle. So let's turn to the actual topic. So I'm not advocating for a Pollyannish perspective here. The fact is that we are deeply divided. In fact, I would suggest that if we talk about purple churches or a purple world, that might be more of an aspiration than anything realistic. There's very little meeting of the so-called red and blue mindsets. We live in very different worlds, operate with very different value systems. And it's actually not just two mindsets, right? In the culture wars, they talk about the red and the blue mindset, but there's a lot more intricacy beneath that. Now, the irony is that this division is in the church as well. We ought to be united by the one who is the truth, but we are estranged from one another because we often adhere to other truth claims above the one who is our real truth. Truth claims, so-called truth claims of culture, of party politics, of racial identity, of economic self-interest. And anytime that we put other truths above the one who is the truth, we are contributing to sinful existence. This contributes in this case to estrangement. And this estrangement also makes it difficult to address other sins in our societies, in part because we don't agree on what those sins are, and in part because we talk past one another. So the central teaching in Christian theology, of course, is that we are in need of reconciliation. So your standard Christian narrative, God made us, God loves us, but we sinned, therefore we are in need of reconciliation. Voila, Jesus Christ, wonderful, end of story. But I want to say that we sometimes miss a depth dimension to that. We not only need reconciliation, there is within us, sometimes very deeply hidden within us, a yearning, a desire for reconciliation. St. Augustine, in the first paragraph of the Confessions, perhaps expresses this most clearly. You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. Paul Tillich notes many centuries later that love is not the union of the strange, but the reunion of the estranged. Reunion presupposes original oneness. We are driven together with the one from whom we are estranged because we belong together and are driven towards each other in love. So there is, at the heart of the Christian faith, a claim not only of us needing reconciliation, but a claim of belonging. Belonging to God, in this case, that is essential to our identity as human beings. But I want to take that further and say, this is not just a vertical issue, right? The gospel is cruciform. Yes, there's that need for reconciliation with God, but there's also that need for reconciliation with each other. And this is rooted, of course, in love. Love is at the heart of this. And the Bible, and this is just a few verses, you can literally go and Google verses about love of neighbor or something like that, and you will find beautiful, quick access to some beautiful verses in which the Bible expresses this link that as I have loved you, so you must love one another. If anyone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother, whom he has seen, cannot love God, whom he has not seen. Whoever loves God must also love his brother. I will go as far as saying that if you do not love your neighbor as yourself, concretely, not just as a fuzzy feeling, then you don't love God, because this is the way in which we exhibit our love. So, our love for God. So, Christian theology, I think, goes much further than a simple commandment here. It's not just that, well, because God loved you, you better love your neighbor. The gospel doesn't operate with that tone. The gospel operates with a deep sense of connection. We are connected with each other in Christ. But I want to go into this a little bit more and look for other sources on this, because I think there are some interesting resources to look at when thinking about the question, why is reconciliation among people not just accidental, but essential to the faith? So, in short, as I said, reconciliation has a cruciform look, right? It's reconciliation with God, but it's also reconciliation with each other. And the question then is, we can easily make the case that we truly belong to God, and therefore reconciliation with God is not just necessary, but something that we ultimately need to be fully human. But what about our reconciliation with each other? I think in a lot of time, especially in Western thought, we think of ourselves as individuals first, and then any sense of reconciliation with each other is understood in contractual terms. It's artificial. I want to suggest that that is a false narrative, that our connection with each other is much more organic than that. And I say this both because of the influence of African culture on my own culture. My own culture is very blended, European, African combination, I guess, but also especially from Christian theology. So I'm not going to go into a lot of this detail, but South Africa's history can be summarized in various ways, but one of them is to look at it as a cycle of traumas. The arrival of first the Dutch East India Company, multinational, one of the largest multinational corporations in history. It started a halfway station in the Cape. This immediately led to conflict, of course. Gradually, they brought in slaves, mostly from Indonesia and Malaysia, but also there were 2 slave ships coming in from West Africa. So immediately the atrocities of colonialism came right in with the colonialism itself, of course. Eventually, the British took over, and the Afrikaners, the descendants of the original colonizers, that's my people, moved up north and started these independent republics. And of course, the moving up north was accompanied by a series of conflict between whites and blacks in South Africa that marked the history of South Africa long before the arrival of official apartheid. And then one of the most significant events was the Anglo-Boer War, the Second Anglo-Boer War, around the turn of the 19th to 20th century, which created, among other things, these horrendous concentration camps, where approximately 40,000 people died, white and black. And this, people surviving from those camps responded the way that people who are survivors often do, and it created this wave of Afrikaner nationalism. This is not an excuse for apartheid. It is an explanation for how the cycles of trauma were continually reinventing themselves. So what I want to suggest is that the racism that created the apartheid system is more than prejudice, just like it is here, is more than prejudice. In the case of South Africa, it was rooted in prejudice, yes, but also in demographic anxieties. And we see that happening in the United States at the moment, with whites getting more fearful the smaller their percentage of the population goes. Again, that's not an excuse, but that's something that we should watch out for. Also generational trauma and so on and so forth. So this set up a system that did much more. This is much more than just prejudice. And if this is much more than prejudice, then reconciliation when it comes to issues of race is much more than a, I'm going to stop hating you kind of thing. It's much more than a, I'm going to be nice to you kind of thing. It has to do with restitution, with dealing with the deep level issues. These are some images from apartheid South Africa. I grew up with this. It shows, in short, a nation deeply divided. You see different facilities for whites and blacks. You also see the trauma created by structural violence. I hid some of the worst examples for you. The Sharpeville massacre was a terrible slaughter. I put another picture over it because it's very, very upsetting. So apartheid came to an end in 1994 after several years of negotiations between the National Party and the African National Congress. Nelson Mandela became president and the hard work of healing injustice began. The South African government rejected the option of Nuremberg-style trials and instead decided on basically a Christian-style narrative with the idea of confession and reconciliation at the heart of it. I would mention to you that Nelson Mandela himself insisted quite strongly that the Methodists should be involved in this. Initially, the leadership was from the Episcopal, the Anglican Church, Desmond Tutu, as well as the Dutch Reformed Church. He wanted them to be involved as well, despite the fact that they were the dominant white church. But he also insisted on the Methodists, and several other churches were involved. And they focused on three things: human rights violations, amnesty, and then reparation. The hope was that people would come and confess their sins. They had to explain that their offenses, more than sins, their crimes that were the result of either their participation in apartheid structures or their participation in anti-apartheid activism. One thing that is really lacking here was that the idea of a wealth tax for the purpose of reparations was never enacted. And I think that has been a problem. All right, so you have to understand the theology that was part of the conversation here. So apartheid theology rested on the theology of the Dutch neo-Calvinist Abraham Kuyper, and he said that racial mixing is against God. Well, he didn't say it, but this is the way they took it up and developed it in South Africa. The idea was that each ethnic group had to develop on its own timeline. This is, in a way, a twisted form of multiculturalism. The technical name for apartheid was separate development. For those of you who are Star Trek fans like me, they call it the Prime Directive in Star Trek, which is why that always bothers me. But this was the idea that different groups are so culturally different that the only way they can live in harmony is through separation. Listen to that bizarre argument: harmony through separation. The result, of course, is that this is not only delusional, but deeply unjust, because it wasn't, as you learned in the United States as well, there is no such thing as separate but equal. So there were various theological responses to this. Classical liberation theology, if you're interested in that, I recommend that you just Google the Kairos document. It makes for some really interesting reading. Then confessional theology, the Baard confession that I'll mention in a little bit more, and then Ubuntu theology that comes to a large extent from Desmond Tutu. And especially Baard type theology and Ubuntu type theology played a role in the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So Ubuntu is this commonly found cultural idea. You find it in most sub-Saharan African cultures with different names. But the idea that we are not fundamentally constituted as individuals first, but our individuality flourishes within community and is shaped by a community. A person is a person through other persons. So authentic humanness lies in one's relationship with others. And I want to suggest that if you want to understand how this one example of reconciliation in history, there are others as well, but this one in South Africa, you want to understand how it operated, you have to understand this concept. This is not the reconciliation of separate individuals. It is the reconciliation of individuals who really ultimately belong together. This sense of it has to do with authentic humanness, that our humanness lie in our relationship with others. The South African theologian John de Groot reminds us that this is not just a cultural phenomenon, but it's a Christian phenomenon, because in Christian theology, there is a deep sense of our being united, that what it means to be a human person has to do with reconciliation. So what I want to suggest, in other words, is that just as in the case of reconciliation with God, which is more than something we need, but in fact it's something that's rooted in our very humanity, of what it means to be human, that reconciliation with each other is rooted in our very humanity. It is at the heart of what it means to be human. It's something that we ought to yearn for, and I think that we deeply yearn for, even if we don't always recognize that yearning. Baard operates with some similar themes. It talks about Christ's work of reconciliation and how that calls us then we are entrusted with the message of reconciliation, that the church is to be a witness to the world. It's not just a matter of inside the church, it is a matter of also in society. And that God is the one who wishes to bring about justice and true peace among people. And it concludes with that classical ancient Christian confession that Jesus is Lord. And this is an echo of the Barman Declaration, which had to do with the rejection of competing truth claims. Now, keep in mind what I said earlier, that often we in the church are divided from each other, even though we are supposed to be united in Christ, because we allow other claims upon our lives. And that is what happened in a very stark way, of course, in Nazi Germany and also in South Africa, where race or ethnicity or other claims on our lives tore us apart. Right. Now, reconciliation is not easy. The Oxford Dictionary gives the most spectacularly inadequate definition I've seen in a long while when it talks about reconciliation as the restoration of friendly relations. Well, that sounds nice, but deeply inadequate. Phil Groves and Parry Jones talk about how the importance of stories of people who live in reconciliation, that instead of necessarily coming up with the definition, we need to look at how people do reconciliation, and there's stories about that. That is more than ending conflict, that it's breaking down the barriers that separate us from God and from one another, and living in community. Community is one of those words that has become quite cheapened. We love to use the language, but I don't know if we know what it means. I don't know if I know what it means. I know it's not just a matter of kind of being nice to one another. There's a deeper level there that we need to think about more. John de Gruchy likewise talks about how reconciliation is often misunderstood and elusive and abused, especially by those who have a vested interest in not actually reconciling with others, in keeping, say, their economic privilege or something like that. Then reconciliation easily becomes a form of whitewashing. There's a bit of a pun in there that's probably meant to be. So John de Gruchy also means that in a world torn apart by conflict, reconciliation is a theme that demands consideration in ways that relate to the context in which we live, and repeats what I've already said about it being central to the Christian faith. Desmond Tutu likewise notes that this is not an easy thing. It is long, it's often painful. And again, he talks about telling stories and hearing stories, listening, and walking together in hope. Forgiveness and reconciliation are a choice, but it is a choice rooted in the recognition that we are all flawed, all children of God. And by the way, as a side note, if you have not read Desmond Tutu's lovely book, Made for Goodness, I really want to recommend that. All right. Dr. Martin Leiner, the director of the Jena Center for Reconciliation Studies in Germany, remarks that every process of reconciliation is unique because each situation is unique and multifaceted, and because cultural and psychological, and I want to include generational trauma, factors would influence how conflict evolves. So I want to note this as a disclaimer. What I'm trying to gauge from the South African experience is some central things that we can learn perhaps from it, but of course conflict and the need for reconciliation in the United States is going to be different because it's a different context. So we can learn from other contexts, but each time it needs to be adjusted for another particular context. And this would be also true on a smaller scale for different churches. Conflict in, say, the Catholic Church might look very similar to conflict in the Methodist Church, but there's going to be differences, right? And this goes without saying. Dr. Leiner also offers insights into the so-called Hölderlin perspective, which is the basic, very simple insight that don't wait for the conflict to end by itself before you work on reconciliation. The way forward is to start now, in the middle of the conflict. And you saw that in South Africa they held these meetings in Daba, which is just business meetings or meetings in the bush, as people would talk about. They would get together and say, okay, we are so deeply divided. How on earth do we move forward? And they started negotiations. Another aspect of this is, of course, truth. This is my third to last slide. We live in a time with so many conflicting truths and alternative truths, which is a horrendous, that's just an horrendous version of lies. Also an overabundance of truths. People don't know what to believe because the internet, for example, just we are full, there's a barrage, just a host of different truth claims that's constantly hitting us from all sides. And And so, yes, reconciliation studies, for example, which is this actual field I've learned and reading about this, suggest that the issue of truth is very complex, but we must insist on it. We must insist on truth. There's no way for us to say, well, you can believe this one thing, ridiculous as it might be, and I'm going to believe this other thing, and we're just going to hang out and just be okay with it. Truth matters because truth, or wrong truth, untruth, lies are deadly and deeply problematic on many other levels. So one of the things that the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission and other similar endeavors elsewhere did was to operate with a straightforward concept of truth-telling. Tell us what you did and why you did it, and repent of your sins. This kind of truth, this simple kind of truth, is not always going to be applicable in every situation. What is more important is what they did, is to create space for truth. We need to create space for truth, not just space for sharing and community, but space for truth. Now, the irony is Christian theology is based on the idea of truth. Literally, we speak of our Savior as the truth, the way, and the life. Nevertheless, I think because we are so divergent in our perspectives, we are often hesitant to make truth claims because we're afraid it might make us intolerant. And of course, sometimes that can happen. But there are some truths that one should, or some truth claims rather, that one should be intolerant of. One of them, in my own historical context, was this silly idea, this idiotic idea that you get harmony through separation. That is not just an alternative truth, that is a lie. And we need to insist on truth and truth-telling and create the space for that. The main criticism of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and also actually of Nelson Mandela, this is coming largely from the Black community, was that they were too reconciliatory, that they were too forgiving, and not focused on justice enough, particularly restorative justice. Marietgen van der Westhuizen, the chair of the Department of Social Work of the University of the Western Cape in South Africa, points to the way in which we can move forward with this, that it's not just about speaking truth and being reconciled with one another on an intellectual or even emotional level and so forth, but it has to become concrete. And it has to be an ongoing process. It didn't end with that. It's an ongoing thing. And part of this, again, we get that emphasis on storytelling, that creation of space for storytelling and for truth, dialogue and collaboration, education of the past. This is something I appreciate very much in Germany, for example, how people are educated. They know about the Holocaust. They're not whitewashing that. Here in the United States, people often don't want to, this is, I'm generalizing, but we know that this is a conversation that sometimes happens. And some folks say, oh, we don't want to learn that stuff. Don't bring that into the school curricula and things like that. Education of the past is important, but also developing a new language. And then very important for this justice issue, transformation of the social structure. So this is a bunch of random things I wrote down after I started thinking about this and reading through this and so forth. You can maybe think of other lessons to be learned from this, but some of the insights I gained from this is that violent histories tend to perpetuate themselves. And this would mean, by the way, that reconciliation is not just a matter of the stereotypical let's sit around and singing Kumbaya together. Reconciliation is hard work because we are, all of us, heirs to violent histories. The histories of colonialism, systemic racism, generational trauma, and under systemic racism and colonialism, of course, also slavery. Secondly, separation does not lead to harmony. The exception would be short-term strategic separation by victims of oppression. So let me add that there are moments when those who are the victims of oppression need to say, okay, for a while, I'm going to withdraw for the sake of my sanity and safety. That's fine. But on the whole, separation does not lead to harmony. We need to truly encounter one another. The church, furthermore, is created by the reconciling work of Jesus Christ and is called to unity and to the work of justice and reconciliation. this should go without saying, and nevertheless, we need to say it because we seem to forget it sometimes. Fourthly, we exist because of each other. Just as we belong to God and therefore yearn to be reconciled to God, we also belong to each other and need to be reconciled to each other. And in fact, not just because we're individuals who would find it nice to hang out together, but because we are constituted by each other. In the fifth place, there is no reconciliation without truth, and creating space for truth and insisting on truth are important tasks. And there's no reconciliation without justice, including restorative justice. Some basic things I would think about if I were in ministry in the church would be create space for stories, start talking now, don't wait. Leave room for lament. I haven't thought about this so much more, but I was just thinking about it yesterday. I actually sat in on a dissertation defense in South Africa of a guy who wrote about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so these were last minute thoughts that came up as I was listening to what he was saying, but leave room for lament. And that's a biblical tradition. If we think back to, especially in the Hebrew Bible, like Jeremiah and so on, right? That there should be space for us to cry, and we should all cry, not just the victims. I cry when I think about in my hometown, when I was growing up in the 1980s, and I became conscientized about apartheid, the thing that conscientized me was the fact that there was no high school for children of color in my hometown. What were they supposed to do? I still want to cry when I think about that. We need to lament the sins, not only against us, but the sins of our own people. And on a practical level, as we engage in conversation with each other, watch out for compassion fatigue, defensive responses. I can do a whole thing just on defensive responses, but we are going to be out of time. So my question would be, I'm throwing a bunch of things at you from my own context and my own theology for you to chew on and to think about how one might apply some of this in your own work. I'm going to stop share, and then I think we have Q&A. I'm only 2 minutes over time. That's pretty decent.
You have a
Entertaining questions at this point? Excuse me. Yes.
Well, I have a thought or question kind of thing, just as you were talking, Dr. Baard, about how we're created in God's image and we long to be reconciled to God and then reflexively to each other. And I was thinking also about how when in our scriptures, when creation is made, it's in balance. And another way of talking about that is that everything is reconciled to everything, the earth, the land, the water, the animals, the people. And I didn't know if you had thought any about creation in this reconciliation piece, or does one inform another or anything like that?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently was we often think about salvation very much, first of all, in individual terms, and often very much in dualistic terms. First of all, in terms of mind-body dualism, this idea that salvation consists of escaping the body and like flying up to heaven or something. But this also has to do with a broader dualism, and I've been thinking a lot about the ecological impact of that, for example, that we often think of salvation as escaping this world, as not only as individuals, but even as a church. But that's nonsense. First of all, that's really not biblical. And secondly, it's just an unrealistic thing. This is where we live. This is our home. Why would God have created this if this world does not matter? Christian theology has always taught that God creates everything. That's the meaning of the doctrine of creation out of nothing. That is nothing that exists outside of God's creative activity, which means also that everything is good. I love Augustine, and Augustine had this very interesting insight on this, right? Everything is fundamentally good. That doesn't mean that evil things don't happen, but they happen as a distortion, not as fundamental reality. And so this idea that we all belong together, that we are made in God's image, that there's a relation between our reconciliation with God and reconciliation with each other, It's all rooted in what I would call a theology of participation. We participate in God's reality, we participate in God. The Eastern Orthodox tradition has a wonderful emphasis on that salvation consists of theosis, divinization, which doesn't mean we become little gods and go rule our own planets or something. It means that we participate more and more in the life of God. And in the life of God, there is no separation of people. There's no animosity between us and God and between those who participate in God. And it ultimately, you cannot truly participate in God if you don't love your neighbor as yourself. And that is, I can start preaching about that forever. I'll be here until tomorrow and your ears will start to burn, because we tend to confuse that with a sense of, well, I have nice, warm, fuzzy feelings towards you. And often when people talk about, for example, racial reconciliation, that's how they think, like, well, I'm not prejudiced against you. I have black friends. That's the worst example of that, right? We've all heard that nonsense. Well, what's the point of that? I don't care about your friend circle. I want to know what you're doing. How are you living this? How are you engaging the world in a way that makes this world a better place so that other people can function? And you don't even have to like other people in order to love them. We don't have to confuse. So anyway, I'm rambling, but there's just a whole host of all of this. Systematic theology is where everything just kind of hangs together. I think I saw a question in the chat. Let me just pull that up so I can.
Sandra was wondering if slides might be available to participate. Sure. Perhaps if you send them to me in the alumni office and we make them available with your permission, is that okay?
Of course, yeah, I can do that.
That would be wonderful. Thank you. So absorbed. I'd love to read it again.
So Tim Moore has a question about how do we sort through competing truth claims and importantly teach others how to do so. My short answer is, I don't know. I mean, I have ideas, but I don't think there's an easy recipe. So the problem is, if you think about, for example, let's just take a recent example, who won the election, right? Now, my view, the reality-based community knows that President Biden won the election, but others would say, no, there was widespread cheating, et cetera, et cetera. And people are convinced of their truths. So how do we sort out what is real? And from what I've read a little bit, I haven't focused on this much, but there's no point actually in telling people the facts, because people are tied up in communities and if they abandon. So if you talk to these QAnon people, for example, I mean, any person looking in from the outside knows that the things they're believing are just utterly ridiculous. And I'm sorry if that offends anybody, but it's the truth. It's ridiculous to believe the kind of nonsense that the QAnon conspiracy theorists believe. But it's very difficult for people to step out of that because much of their life is tied up with that. That's where they find community. That's where they find belonging. And so instead of just saying, well, what you believe is silly, even though half the time that's exactly what I'm thinking, I realized that the way forward is to create other community, to bring people into other forms of community so that they can step away. This is true for a great many things. I once read that a lot of the soldiers that came back from Vietnam were addicted to heroin, and yet something like 90% of them recovered, which is extremely high because heroin addiction is notorious for being very hard to beat. Why was that? Well, the thing that made them hooked on that drug was the war. Once they left the situation, it was much easier to beat it. This is in contrast to those who might be addicted here because of, say, a bad family situation that led to this. It's much harder for them to escape the situation. So the problem is not simply the addiction. The problem is the community that they are, or the place, the space, etc., that they're involved in. And so many of these sort of conspiracy theories things, for example, have to do, that's like a form of addiction. We need to get people out of the network of that.
Mhm.
That's hard to do. That's one, actually. There's, of course, there can be just other truth claims, theological truth claims. Methodists and Presbyterians might have different ideas about, I don't know, justification and sanctification, whatever. We agree more than, despite that, what did somebody called it before, we were discussing only a hair breadth of difference, but it was a pretty thick hair. But we can, there's space for things where we can differ in terms of nuance. That's fine, but that's different from completely competing worldviews. Anyway, so I'm just kind of thinking out loud with you, Tim, because I don't have a quick answer to this difficult concept. My own answer from my presentation is we need to start by creating the space for that, the space for examining truth. And it will require a commitment from all people to truly search for truth and not just stick to their already pre-existing ideas. So that's the starting point. You can take it from there.
Other questions, please?
Dr. Baard, I was just wondering, in Germany right now, we're losing Holocaust survivors. And so there's a very intentional effort to keep the stories alive, to make sure people understand that the Holocaust is not a figment of imagination or a conspiracy theory, but that it actually happened. How do we as Christians make sure that that is not forgotten, but not, and I'm quoting here, to the best of my ability, but not re-traumatize or glorify violence? What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts on that is that it's a very fine line.
Yeah.
There's also, apart from glorifying violence, there's also the risk of whitewashing. If we think about here in the United States, the way Martin Luther King is often commemorated, right? Everybody claims him. He's everybody's favorite person to claim for their side. And often without actually looking at the serious things he said about things like restorative justice, for example. And he's turned into just a kind of a nice fuzzy figure, which is a dishonor to his memory. And so that's the one risk. At the other side, you don't want to make this some kind of spectacle of let's just, and I think sometimes that happens with the Holocaust. I mean,
yes,
if you look at the History Channel, which is just one big Hitler fest, morning, noon, and night, honestly, I've never seen a place that's so obsessed with that one bit of history, and then often in a way that's like, ooh, look at how shocking. There's also, of course, the risk of finger pointing. It's very easy to point the finger at Germany. Just last week when I was reading about the infamous Meghan and Harry interview, which I am not going to debate because that's serious business. But the infamous Harry and Meghan interview, and some people's response was, well, you know, the royal family are just a bunch of Germans. That is a prejudiced response. That's nonsense. That's not a serious, now, of course, this is a valid, silly topic, but it was just illustrative of, I think, something we sometimes do is it becomes a handy tool to just say, well, those South Africans, they're the real racists. Those Germans, they're the real Nazis. When the same, and this is why I emphasize when I talk about these things, look at the root causes, because the same root causes are present in other contexts. Mm-hmm. South Africa, look at the generational trauma, look at the long history of conflicts that preceded even the conflict of apartheid. Look in Germany, it should be more than just, oh, how shocking. It should be about what led to this.
Yeah.
And as you know, I'm a big fan of Paul Tillich, who wrote an amazing book analyzing the depth dimension of National Socialism in Germany. And you can recognize similar moves elsewhere, and that's very frightening. So looking at root causes helps. But we do have to do the storytelling as well. So do interviews with all of the last survivors, because it's necessary.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
That was a bit rambling, but there's so many things one can say about this.
Yeah, thank you.
Valerie talks here about courage and moral and social accountability. And I agree, the lack of willingness to discuss the history And this is one point I just mentioned briefly, and I'd like to hear more from you, Valerie, about this. When you talk about race, right, this is where you really see this very clearly. When you say you have, let's just talk about white and black. Of course, that's not the whole picture when it talks about race, but let's talk about white and black for a moment. Very often whites are reluctant, or they would engage in conversation up to a point and then sort of shut down. A lot of it has to do with defensiveness, which is a psychological mechanism and somewhat understandable, but we need to break through that. And so one of the things I always advise when I talk to other white people, I say, don't make it about you. It's not about you. It's not about your guilt feelings. Stop feeling guilty. If you didn't do it, then don't feel guilty about it, but take up responsibility. There's a distinction between guilty feelings and taking up responsibility. My people made apartheid. No, I didn't vote for it. I was born in it. I didn't create it. So there's no point in me wallowing in a sense of guilt. But of course, I can't escape it completely. But that's not helping anybody. It would make me withdraw from the conversation. I need to participate in the conversation. And one way of enabling that is to say, stop focusing on yourself and listen. I don't know what your thoughts are about that. I see that you are a self-described eco-womanist, and I'm like, ooh, so interesting.
I'm not sure if my mic should be on or not, but it's on at the moment. So Dr. Baard, you know that I definitely appreciate all of your thought leadership and scholarship. I think that based on our brief conversation last month, I think you and I are on the same page when we have to, we saw it just firsthand the other day on one of those talk shows where a young lady was trying to justify Pierce Morgan's behavior, Sharon Osbourne.
Oh, yeah.
And the discussion between she and Cheryl Underwood, you know, that wasn't an unfamiliar setting for a lot of Black women in particular, when it comes to that engagement with white women who take on the posture that she took on. I was really proud of Cheryl because she did what we're supposed to do, just hold fast, because you can't control the emotions of others, but you can control your own when you're having these conversations. And to your point, I don't subscribe to white supremacy. I'm not white, but at the same time, those who are a part of that culture, to your point, you don't have to own a system that you didn't create, but you do need to be accountable for where you are in the space that you occupy now and how you engage with others. So, you know, you and I can ramble on too, so I'm going to turn off my mic and thank you again.
But I appreciate your insights very much. And I didn't follow the whole Sharon Osbourne thing. I think she would be very flattered by you calling her a young lady, though. But all us old ladies are always happy when we call that. So you're right. I mean, I would say I need to own the system, but I don't need to make it about me. And that's my advice for white people, by the way. That's my general advice for my fellow white people, is when it comes to race. But you can, of course, translate this to other similar conversations. And as a feminist theologian, and I talk to men, and I've studied mostly with men. So it is a similar issue where people would say, you make me feel bad. Not, yes, but it's not about that. Stop feeling bad and be my ally. And be willing to make mistakes. That's another thing that, this is a little bit off the topic for today, but I think we're so afraid sometimes of either being offensive to others or of being accused by others that we're afraid of making mistakes. One of the things I appreciated about the South African kind of the church scene, so to speak, was the willingness of people to really engage one another. I have some of the richest, most amazing experiences of my life have been with South Africans of color. There are different ethnicities in South Africa, so I'm going to use that vague generalized term. I hope that's okay. But South Africans of color who have reached out in a loving way. I realize what a gift that is. I recognize that is a deep gift. And I know what a healing thing that is. And I hope to be mutual with that and not just be the recipient of that. But that, that willingness to say, I'm going to see you, we're going to talk, that should be there on both sides. Now this goes beyond issues of race, right? If we think about the debates in the church about the LGBTQIA community, plus, there's a plus in there somewhere. I have a hard time at my age keeping up with all the letters, but the debates about that's often so unsavory in the churches. We need to be able to be willing to delve deeply into things such as how do we read scripture together on this issue, for example, instead of making it a culture war. And I think often we've made it a culture war and we stick to our guns instead of truly engaging each other. I'm not sure if we're out of time yet, so.
We're fine. Yeah, I want to be sure everybody has opportunity to ask questions if they do, and I don't want to cut it off too soon, but are there other questions for Dr. Baard? Dr. Baard, we are so very grateful to you for the time you have given to us this day, and for, I told you at the very beginning, you would just whet my appetite, and you did. This is really, there's so much more that could be said and understood, but you've given me much to think about in terms of truth and reconciliation and responsibility. And I appreciate that. I know I speak for everyone else here.
Well, thank you. And I would invite folks at me, if you have thoughts on this, I'm curious to learn more. So by all means, my email is on their website. You can find me easily if you ever want to, engage on any conversation.
And I've told the participants to just send me an email and I'll forward those PowerPoint slides to them if you don't mind sending them to me.
I don't mind. Just ignore any typos that you might find there.
Understood. Okay. Well, we thank you very much. I now call on Dr. Tim Moore, who is Director of Donor Development and based on our Charlotte campus, to make an announcement regarding CEUs. Dr. Moore.
Thank you, Clay, and thank you, Dr. Baard. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Just wanted to say that for those of you who are interested in getting a continuing education credit or certificate for this webinar today, you may simply send an email to Nicole Smith in our alumni office. I'm going to post her email address in the chat, but also if you put your name in the chat, we'll save the chat, and then we'll have that list of those folks who want credit. But you can, if you'll send an email, and also if you will put your name in the chat, and we'll happily get you a certificate for continuing education. If you're looking for a certificate of continuing education, you might not be, but if you are, we'll get you one. But we again are delighted that you are here today, and thank you for sharing in this time, and thank you for spending an afternoon with us, Dr. Baard. It's been great.
I echo that. We thank all of you who were participating with us in this virtual gathering. We thank our speakers, Dr. Baard and Dr. Blount, and we thank you, our valued alums who could be with us. Would also like to thank my colleagues on the UPSIM staff and planning team, Reverend Crystal Siegel, Dr. Dorothy Tripodi, Dr. Tim Moore, Reverend Nicole Smith, and our Zoom Meister, Mike Frontiero, who called us all together. Mike tells me that for those who wish to remain online for a few minutes after the gathering concludes, this Zoom site will remain open for a few minutes anyway, so you can greet one another. Dr. Blount mentioned, and I'll say again, I hope you will register to join us for our annual Sprint Lectures to be held virtually on May 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Dr. Ted Smith, who is Professor of Preaching and Ethics at the Candler School of Theology of Emory University, is our Sprint Lecturer this year. His topic, as Dr. Blount mentioned, will be "No Longer Shall They Teach One Another, the End of Theological Education." I'm looking forward to hearing that series of lectures in May. The preachers for Sprunts are the Reverend Meg Peary McLaughlin and the Reverend Jarrett McLaughlin, co-pastors of the University Presbyterian Church in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Again, we are so glad you could join us today. And now will you join me in our benediction and blessing? Beloved people of God, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, anything that God is excellent and worthy of praise, keep on doing these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Amen. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Dr. Baard, will you stay? Will you stay for a second?
Sure. I think the dog is the perfect conclusion.
Absolutely.
Dr. Baard, I'm sorry, I did have another question. Do you have a second?
Yeah, sure.
Well, I was curious about we were just talking about the sort of ineffectuality of guilt,
Yeah.
but then we also were talking about making space for lament.
Mhm.
And so I wondered if you could kind of touch about how to kind of hold those two things together or not, or.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I have to think about more, but I'll try to shoot from the hip for a moment there. So first of all, I think we need to also make a distinction between guilt and guilty feelings, right? If you truly have guilt, then you need to confess it. At the same time, guilty feelings is actually a bigger problem sometimes for people because it becomes impossible for them, and they sort of harden their hearts because they can't deal with what they're hearing. And this is especially true for those who are standing on the side of being accused. And that's obviously something I live on a daily basis, and with good reason, in terms of the history of my own people and my own church. Well, not my church, but my old church. The issue of lament is, I think, interesting to think about. Also, if you are in a position such as that of the historical oppressor, we need to lament the things that have been done in our names. I sometimes suggest that one should also look at the way in which systems of oppression harm the oppressor group. It's risky to say that because you don't want to say, oh, they're the real victims of it, because that's also a problem, right? Because you don't want to do that. But at the same time, racism, of course, primarily harms people of color. It also harms whites. I was just reading an essay this morning about how somebody said that the Confederacy was a hoax perpetrated on whites and still is. And I thought, what an interesting perspective, because it shows, for example, how slavery, for example, drove down wages also for poor whites. So it is part of that. But of course, then they are being blinded to that reality through racist rhetoric that gives them a false sense of pride. And so this is a historical example of how these systems are harmful to everybody. It also harms us on a different level. It harms us simply in terms of relationships. If I think back to when I was at seminary in Princeton, our group of 6 who started together, there was me and one guy from Germany, and then all of the people who were from the United States were people of color. There was one guy who was Korean American, one woman who was part Pakistani and part American, and another woman who was also Korean American. And I looked at them one day and I thought to myself, of these people, only this German guy would have been allowed to go to high school with me. And I lamented the fact that this is me being selfish for a moment. I lamented also for myself about all the friendships that I missed out on. Now, again, I don't want that to be misread as saying it's about me. Of course not. It's about the kids who didn't have the high school to go to when I was growing up. It's mostly about them. But if we can't claim the fact that we are all harmed by this, and if we can't lament all the bad things that happened to other people in the first place, but also how it harmed the fabric of our societies,
Yes.
then I don't know what we're going to do. We have to do that.
Mhm.
And it is a better alternative than hardening our hearts and saying, well, it wasn't me. Stop accusing me. Because that's often our response, right? It's like we feel bad, and we don't want to deal with it. Sorry, the long answer, I think out loud. So then my answer, I say basically 2 sentences worth of things, and I take 20 sentences to get there.
No, thank you, Dr. Baard. I think guilt sometimes is just ultimately it becomes some kind of excuse or way to get out from under, if that's where our thoughts stay. And
Exactly.
so
And the irony is, ironically, we make that about ourselves then.
right, exactly. Yeah. So
Like,
we,
I don't want to
again,
hear
miss
that.
the point. Yeah.
And so this is why I find it liberating to distinguish between guilt and or guilty feelings rather, and responsibility.
Right.
So even if you are not factually guilty of something, but it has privileged you,
Mhm.
you still need to take responsibility for it.
Right. And if I may add, you need to look at the trauma that may exist in somebody else. I was asked one time to lead a meeting where several Jewish persons were present because I was German. Now, I had done nothing wrong, but these persons were much older than I was at the time, but I left. Not because I felt guilty, but because I did not want to add to the pain that they had already experienced.
Yeah.
And clearly where they were in processing that pain was not, if I was going to re-traumatize or add to that trauma, that would not be helpful. And that would not be loving your neighbor. But that didn't necessarily mean that it was my fault that they felt that way. But my being German triggered something in them. And to that, I needed to show sensitivity. Is that what you're talking about?
I think that's part of it. I mean, I've had similar experiences where people of color look at me with a sense of distrust. And that hurts. It hurts like hell.
Oh, it did not feel good.
But
I did not sail out of there. You know, I mean, it took me a while to get to that point.
But we got to get over that.
Yeah, I know.
We are not the primary victims here. And so I know exactly what you mean. And you were absolutely right in being sensitive and walking away. And the thing is, again, it's not about my feeling of, hey, it wasn't me. I didn't do that to you.
Yeah.
It's a sense of, you know what? You have the historical right to mistrust me. Or to
Absolutely.
want me in your presence because of things that happened to you. And I'll walk away if that's what's required.
Yeah.
That's a very hard lesson to learn. But yeah, and all I can do then is go off by myself and say, you do what you need to do for your healing. And if I can't be part of that, that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
But these are difficult things. I hate the fact that we inherited the world like this.
Yeah, I do too.
And that's the part we need to lament.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anything else? I gotta go read some essays about information fluency before our QEP meeting this afternoon. Really not exciting.
thank you so much for staying for
Bye.
So grateful to you.
You too.
Well,
You as well.
Thank you.
Past the pandemic, I want to have sit-down coffee with everybody.
And tea, South African tea.
Now I want coffee. I had not enough sleep. I need coffee.
Oh, okay. All right.
all right.
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye.